everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by IRI Consultants. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit IRI at iriconsultants.com. I am Jennifer Oraqua, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. Now, when disaster strikes or a crisis occurs, wouldn't it be great to have access to the wisdom of over 100 crisis leaders, survivors, and psychologists right when you need it the most? My guest on Project HR today certainly thinks so, and she said about compiling data to create tools that can help leaders feel better prepared to take on disruption, stress, and uncertainty, come what may. I'm talking today with Jolie Wills, co-founder and director of Hummingly, a company dedicated to helping support people through difficult times. Thanks so much for being here today on Project HR, Jolie.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Jolie, both you and your co-founder, Elizabeth McNaughton, have firsthand real-life experience with disasters. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've both been through?
Well, we often tend to say that our careers have been a series of disasters. Sometimes that falls a little bit flat when people don't realize that you mean it literally. So for Elizabeth, she started working on what is known as the Boxing Day tsunami. So she's worked in serious disasters the world over. And we met on the Christchurch earthquakes. So huge earthquakes we had in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's the beginning of my disaster story in a sense. I'm a cognitive scientist by background, but it all happened for us. It was like 4:35 in the morning. It was pitch black in winter, September in 2010. And we were really rudely awoken by this massive earthquake. It was just huge. And I'd grown up with earthquakes and kind of quite liked them, a bit like, a thunderstorm, but this was something entirely different. And my husband and I just sort of ping-ponged off the walls down to the kids, one to each, without being able to hear anything over the roar of the noise. And to this day, our son, who at the time was 10, so our kids were 10 and 6, they are now both at university. But our son at the time said the scariest thing was being woken up by, this, I'd say it in kilos, but I might need a translation into pounds, but 100 kilos of his father, big rugby player, sort of flying in and landing on top of him. So for him, that was almost as scary as the earthquake itself. But that was where it all started for me. And then, I guess that it's the beginning of the story, but it's probably not the most important part of the story in terms of, that came after in the months and years that followed.
So what inspired you to create Hummingly?
Well, if you think about what came next, we had 15,000 aftershocks. Just let that sit for a minute, but this is over 5 years, 15,000 aftershocks any time of the day without any warning. And that really changes the way that you go about your daily life and the way that you parent, But along with raising a family, I was managing a team, and they were under this immense pressure to perform, you can imagine at the time. And along with all the aftershocks, they're dealing too with this uncertainty and anxiety and the sense of making progress, and then suddenly being back to square one when we get another aftershock. So, there may be some parallels here with COVID, and it was longer and more difficult than what anyone anticipated. And so we knew that we had to find much better ways to support and sustain this team. They were burning out at a rate that to us wasn't acceptable. And so we started with a design challenge, really. It was like, how do we prevent burnout and damage, and how do we maximize growth for our people and our teams and our organization? That's what we really needed if we're going to hit peak performance. So that's where it started, and it led to global research. So we ended up speaking to over 100 crisis leaders around the world, and that was the start of the journey that resulted in Hummingly. Elizabeth and I really working on training and guidance to make it just that little bit easier for leaders, teams, and communities under pressure. I think right now, risk, uncertainty, and this change that is at this incredibly fast pace, that's really defining features of our times. And we need our leaders and our teams and our organizations and our communities to be up for the challenge. So, for us, it's a hard ask, but we really want to put in place the learning from crisis leaders and teams all over the world so that people are set up not just to survive, but to thrive when they hit tough times.
And I think a lot of us, you mentioned COVID, in the wake of the global pandemic, we feel like we're a little better prepared to handle the next crisis. Do you think in general that we as leaders prepare for difficult times as well as we should? Or if not, why not?
Oh, I think the short answer is no.
Hmm.
Although you're right, COVID has taught us a lot,
Hmm.
but there's two longer answers. And the first is that Elizabeth and I have heard the word unprecedented all the time. Like we hear it after every huge disaster that we respond to. And that kind of means that we perpetually get to believe three things, that no one could have seen this coming, that
Mm.
no one's been here before, and no one knows how to best navigate this. That there's that sense that there's no blueprint, there's no roadmap. And that's actually quite unhelpful. And it really is doing it the hard way. So tough times, they are predictable and they are repeatable. And there is extensive expertise for how to navigate these unprecedented situations. We just need to be let into the secrets of people who've done it before. And I think that's such a relief for people to know.
Hmm.
So the second part is that, as a cognitive scientist, I mean, for me, this is really interesting. But until we've had a taste or some lived experience of that long, difficult tail end after disruption, so, think big disaster or think COVID, until we've had that taste, as humans, we really struggle to imagine what it's going to mean or what it will involve, right? And pair that with after every big event, we have this heroic and honeymoon period where we tend to have this really naive sense of what's ahead. So everyone thinks as hard as it is, it's going to be sorted much quicker and much more smoothly than what it ever is in reality. So if we can't imagine that hard, grueling bit ahead, we fail to prepare for it. So yeah, my answer is no, we've got a bit of work to do in that space, I think.
All right, Jolie, I'm going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. When we return, I want to talk about how leaders can deal with disasters and help their teams deal with them as well. Stay with us.
In today's ever-evolving political and economic climate, the relationships you have with your employees can be the most critical to the success of your business, as well as the most vulnerable. At IRI Consultants, we understand the pressures your labor and employee relations teams are under, from changes at the NLRB to immigration issues, to controversial Supreme Court decisions, which makes it more important than ever for employers to stand up for their values and protect their businesses. With over 4 decades of experience in labor and employee relations, the IRI team brings a wide range of expertise. Our team includes published authors, CEOs, HR and communications professionals, former labor and employee relations executives, public relations experts, and even investigative journalists and award-winning podcasters. The IRI team will work with you every step of the way so that you can focus on running your business while we handle your trickiest labor and employee relations challenges. Get started today at iriconsultants.com. That's iriconsultants.com.
I'm back now with Jolie Wills, co-founder and director of Hummingly. So, Jolie, you mentioned a honeymoon phase and then the hard, grueling bit. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we can expect to see play out in the wake of COVID?
Sure. There's the next bit's not so nice, in the sense that we end up with, a lot of fatigue. There's all that uncertainty that we're grappling with. And, you get that sense of progress only to be sort of smacked back down onto your butt, really, with another aftershock or another outbreak, for example. And, the rattiness that you might see in teams, because none of us really, if we're honest, are at our best selves when we're really exhausted. So these are all normal things. If you're seeing them play out in your teams, or in yourself or others around you, this can be predicted, from the pattern that we've seen play out again and again after disaster. But the thing that most people haven't experienced yet, and so we're not talking about it as individuals, teams, and organizations, is that post-traumatic growth. It's a real thing and it's part of the pattern that we can expect to see play out. And that doesn't diminish the tough road that people travel to get to the growth at the other end. It's really hard won. But it can be this real relief, I think, for people to know that when you're in the trough where everything feels super hard, really tiring, exhausting as individuals and teams, it doesn't mean that you're off track or that good things aren't ahead, And so I think that's a really important message. And we can certainly help people get more people to growth and get there faster, and easier if we're applying that learning from those who've had to travel this path many times before.
So you talked about the typical pattern we can expect to see after a huge disaster or a massive disruption. On a corporate level, what do leaders need to know?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that leading through that long tail after disruption, like people are now with COVID, it's a really tough gig. And I don't say that to scare people, but I say it to reassure them. Because if as leaders they're feeling pretty tired or maybe a little wobbly or like they've been shouldering a whole lot, or while they're working out what it is they need to do, it feels really overwhelming. Then I would say that is pretty normal. Have some faith. So we have yet to come across a leader who has found that this stuff easy. So, I think to be reassured by that, it can be really reassuring to know that if it feels hard, because it is hard and for very good reasons, right? Leading in this environment is very different to leading in business as usual times.
So what are the leadership challenges? I mean, how is leadership different from business as usual?
Well, I can give you the top 5. The first one is uncertainty. People are making decisions with this very imperfect information when even the very near future, that's uncertain, and the environment's constantly changing and rapidly moving underneath your feet. So that uncertainty. The second one is scale, because so many aspects of your work and life is impacted all at once. So it's kind of like having to go through the drive-through and ordering a supersize on everything, and on the thinking you need to do, on the energy you need to bring, on the vision you need to pull up out of your hat in a sense. So, uncertainty and scale. Then we've got time. Because change is so rapid, there's massive time pressure. You're constantly making these decisions between these competing priorities, all of which are important, but they can't be done at the same time, And then the fourth one is psychology. If you think about all the routines that get turned upside down by a massive disruption like COVID, all the ways that we used to do things, those structures, they save us this time, they save us energy, they save us attention. So having to change and innovate all of those things takes a massive amount of energy, Tolerance and optimism for others takes energy. Managing your anxiety and your emotions takes energy. Supporting others takes energy. And so you've got this massive energy depletion exercise. So you end up with really tired people, and that impacts our psychology individually and collectively. And it's a really important part of leading in this kind of environment. And then lastly, there's the endurance piece. It always takes longer than it's expected. It's always harder than is expected. It's kind of like signing up for a 10K run, what is that in miles?
6
miles. Thank you. A 6-mile run. And then suddenly realizing it's turning into a marathon. So you set out at this cracking pace because the situation is demanding it of you. And we can kind of hold that for a while. We can maintain it because we put on hold all the things that would normally give us energy, right? All our things that we do to nurture our relationships, all our health basics. But when you do this for a prolonged period, which is what this always is for leaders, it has very real impacts, including burnout. So, as I said, if it feels hard, no one does find this easy. It is a tough gig, and we can learn from others who've been there before just to make it that little bit easier.
Yeah. As a runner myself, that analogy just exhausts me. The idea of signing up for a 10K and all of a sudden you're running a marathon.
It feels cruel. It really does.
It does. So, but within organizations, leaders, they have to deal with disasters on a personal level. They, just like that 10K analogy that you just gave, but they've also got to help their teams deal with it. So do most leaders feel that responsibility?
I think for all the reasons we just spoke about, leaders, they shoulder this massive amount after disruption. They often have this incredibly, or it feels impossible, this balance to strike between the need for performance, because sometimes the pressure on our deliverables, it only goes up during these times, quite often. And they're balancing that and the message they feel they should be giving to their people around, well, just do what you can, we understand. So that feels like an impossible balance. And so they're often in a really difficult position. They're serving as an extra sort of buffer for stress for their people, all while they're trying to meet targets and constantly innovating in the way that we work. So most leaders feel it quite acutely. And then others we see will sometimes attempt to move past it, often kind of not because the time's right, but because they feel incredibly saturated. They can't take on much more. And in that kind of event, then there's like this gravitational pull back towards something that feels really normal, something that feels more constant, is incredibly strong. So sometimes we see leaders may push to go back to business as usual as it was before, often prematurely, or when it's not, not right for the context that we're in now.
Now, we talked a little bit about preparing for a crisis through education beforehand. Are there things we should be putting in place now in advance of any kind of disaster or disruption that can help us deal with it in that moment when it strikes?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, that whole risk, uncertainty, disruption, change at this crazy pace that we're seeing now, they are defining features of our time. This is the new world that we're living in. So preparing for disaster and disruption is not just about having business continuity plans in place. We need to really make sure that leaders and teams have the knowledge and skills and resources to adapt and do well in the face of whatever comes our way. And that's going to stand us up, to do well no matter what disaster, disruption, or good times. So we need that learning from disasters to be commonplace, not secret in a sense, because this disruption is going to be more and more a feature of the world that we operate in. And that throws up not just challenges, but also opportunities, especially for those organizations that are ready for disruption. So if you think about it, disruption ready is future ready. But right now, most organizations, they're kind of at their most vulnerable. People are running on empty. We've got people operating at the very edge of their capacity, and there's not a lot in the tank for the next thing. So, putting in place those pressure-tested strategies to help build that team cohesion, performance under pressure, doing that now, I think that's the ticket. It's all about setting those leaders and teams up, not just to survive, but to thrive. And doing it in a way that's not adding extra burden to leaders who are already feeling pretty tired right now.
Yeah, that's a brilliant perspective. All right, Jolie, it's time for another quick break. We're going to be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and my guest today is Jolie Wills, co-founder and director of Hummingly. We are back. So, Jolie, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Hummingly. Can you tell me about the research that went into creating the tools that you now offer?
Sure. So, we're leading these teams in the most trying of conditions in Christchurch, and we were putting all of these wellbeing approaches in place to try and sustain and support them, but we were still burning them out, right? And the research to guide us just wasn't there when it came to these particularly trying times. And I remember thinking, this is not the first disaster the world's ever had. Like, what can we learn from elsewhere? So I was lucky enough to get a Winston Churchill Fellowship, so I could visit these different disaster zones around the world and really look at that tail end, that prolonged stress piece. And it turns out we definitely were not alone in terms of the impacts that we were seeing in our people and in our teams and on our organisation. And we explored what are the strategies that we need to put in place that really work when the pressure's on to support the resilience and wellbeing of teams. And at the same time, Elizabeth did a Winston Churchill Fellowship looking at leadership. If we could go back in time, what do you wish you'd known before, as a leader? And so we've spent the last decade, pulling all that together and then designing and applying the training and these practical tools that we wished we'd had. And now with COVID, it turns out that we're not the only ones that needed it. The whole world seems to need access to these approaches right now.
So I'm curious, you learned about strategies for when the pressure's on, what leaders wish they had known. What would you say is the most common mistake made by leaders during a crisis?
Oh, that's an easy one, I think, and it's an easy trap to fall into too. I think it's not being intentional with the methods and the strategies that we set ourselves up to sustain ourselves for the long haul, right? Especially not having a strategy in place for keeping perspective. So when we're under prolonged stress, when we get to that whole endurance piece, you can actually expect to lose perspective at some point. So this is where we see the most amazing leaders fall over. They lose perspective of how their issues fit into the wider organizational picture. They lose perspective on their own behavior. Their reactions can have the sense of not being in proportion anymore. Everything's off kilter, and it can really affect their decision making. And so to counteract that, what we've seen people do that is a really great piece of advice is to put in place a personal board, right? If you can expect to lose perspective through this endurance piece, have some trusted wise heads, people that you can have these really safe conversations with, you can admit challenges with, whose feedback that you're going to really respect. You can test decisions with, So it's really helpful if those trusted wise heads, they can really help people keep perspective, and keep them accountable for all the things that they need to do to manage their own resilience and to sustain themselves through, that leadership journey. And in the long run, those who are most comfortable reaching out for advice and proactively have those support strategies in place, they're the ones that usually do the best in terms of this leadership gig.
So, Jolie, I'm curious, in all of your research and your interviews and everything that was discussed, what was the single best piece of advice that you heard?
Well, it's more of a story that comes with a question, and that's since formed the basis for one of the most important pieces of advice. And it all came with a lady that we were interviewing as part of our Winston Churchill Fellowship, a phenomenal leader. We were so excited to have the opportunity to interview her. And she let us know to meet her at home rather than at work. And that was because she was off on stress leave. And so, we offered to postpone, do the recording another time, leave it be. And she said, no, it's more important now more than ever. And so we went to visit her, and she explained basically her situation, after high performing for such a long period of time, that sustained pressure and stress that she was under. She just hit that saturation point, and hit burnout at the stage, and she was having some pretty significant health issues. And she said to us, but that's not even the scary thing. We said to her, well, what's more scary? And she said, actually, when I stopped and turned around and I looked at my team, I realized that my team was only about 3 weeks behind me, right? And so since we often, ask the question, something we should be checking in on ourselves regularly as leaders, where am I at? Because where I'm at is where I'm leading others to. Am I leading them to a place of calm, a place of chaos, to burnout? So where am I at and where am I leading others to? That has really stuck with me as a really important piece of advice and a question to be asking ourselves.
So tell me a little bit about the tools that Hummingly offers to help deal with these potential tough times.
Well, over the last 5 years, Elizabeth and I, in various different locations, we've been running these masterclasses and workshops for organisations in many different sectors, all over the globe. And the piece of feedback we keep hearing most often is, I only wished we'd had this earlier. And now we've got people working from home. We've got these dispersed teams. We've got long COVID. We've got, we're bringing in team members at a time of really high levels of stress and burnout. And so these leadership skills and team cohesion and connection and well-being, it's never been more important. And so Elizabeth and I, we've kind of packaged ourselves up, in a sense, into a workshop in a box. So we've got one for leaders and one for teams, and we've put all our knowledge and expertise into that box. And all you have to do is gather your people, and hand out the practical tools and push play. Again, it's about making it easy for leaders right now who are pretty tired, and it's the ultimate mix of face-to-face, tangible, and digital experiences, kind of like we're in the room. And the tools that you find inside, there's the Doing Well pack. That's a set of 100 cards that we designed as part of our design challenge, around how do we really maximize growth and minimize burnout and damage for people working in this kind of environment. And so using that pack of cards, people can make this protective plan to help prevent burnout and support wellbeing and performance. So it's kind of like PPE for the psychosocial hazards that we're facing. But you can also use them to spark connections and conversations and support cohesion in teams. So, that's just a little bit about what it is we're doing right now to try and lift the lid on some of those secrets from disasters.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about that workshop in a box. I'm fascinated. Is this sort of an ongoing thing? Is it a finite period of time that you would go through these exercises?
So it's a workshop where you can bring everybody together for that face-to-face time. And I know that we're working in this hybrid scenario, but that face-to-face time, even if it's every now and again, to really boost cohesion is so important. And so, over 3 hours, we're taking you through all sorts of discussions, activities, and using these tangible practical tools so that people leave feeling a lot more confident. They've got those strategies that they can be applying in terms of their team, how they work together in terms of their organisation, how they, prevent stress and really support people through pressure. And as individuals, how do they sustain themselves?
And Hummingly also offers classes, right? Are those for the leaders? Are those for employees? How does that work?
Absolutely. So we still offer, so the workshop in a box is basically those classes packaged up so you can deliver them anytime, anywhere with your people. And then we also have the live version where we can run them either face-to-face or virtually. We still have those available. The workshop in a box just makes that little bit easier in terms of, taking out some of the weight of having to schedule and arrange things. And, the reality is there's just Elizabeth and I. So in terms of scalability,
Yeah, absolutely. So if I want to find out more about you or about Hummingly, where can I go?
So honeymoon.co is where you go. So www.honeymoon.co, or feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
All right. And a link to Hummingly's website will be included in this episode's companion guide. Be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com. Right now, though, Jolie, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are questions I ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Right hand on the buzzer.
All right. First question is a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about defying disaster and managing tough times. So in your opinion, Jolie, in any crisis, which is more important for leaders to employ, communication or empathy?
Oh, empathy. That's tough. I think they're both vital, but good communication must be filled with empathy. So empathy sits under everything. But that said, communication is so important that in crisis we tend to say, communicate till it hurts, and communicate some more. But if I had to pick one, empathy, for sure.
Oh, very good. All right, next question. What is the best book that you've read recently?
Can I cheat and give you one that Elizabeth and I co-wrote because it's just perfect for these times? This is pre our Hummingly days. It's super short because time, energy and brain space, they're in super short supply at the minute, but it showcases some of that learning from leaders around the world after massive disruption, and it's called Leading in Disaster Recovery, a companion through the chaos. It's a free download, so anyone can download it.
Very good. All right, we'll make sure we include that in the episode companion as well. All right, next question. What is your favorite thing about the work that you do?
I think it's seeing the relief, seeing these great people leaving us feeling just that little bit lighter and just a little bit more prepared to handle whatever comes their way. Seeing this knowledge end up where it should be and seeing people find it super helpful, I guess that feels pretty great.
Yeah, for sure. All right, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given?
This was after, working in the thick of the Christchurch earthquakes, and from a good friend of mine who's a recovery leader in Australia. And again, it comes in a form of a story that has a question with it. And she told me the story clearly for a reason at the time, which will make sense as I tell it. But her name's Kate, and she tells the story of when she was very first starting out in her career, and she went for a job interview, and she said, I'd nailed just about every question, was feeling really confident, and then the hiring manager asked me one final question that really threw me, and that question was, so Kate, are you a martyr or are you a professional? And Kate said, sorry, I'm not sure if I understand the question. And the hiring manager said, oh, no problem either way. Just let me know, are you a martyr? In which case I know that I'll be able to fill every part of my roster with, any gaps. You'll be willing to turn up and just keep giving and giving. You'll be here the latest in the day. You'll be here first thing in the morning. You won't say no when you should. She said, you'll be driven by the mission, but you'll be driven so hard and fast that I'll just know not to invest in you, in terms of your professional development, because we'll get a huge amount out of you, but only for a very short period of time. You might last a year maybe. She said, but if you're a professional, you'll still be very driven by what it is we're trying to achieve, but you will have, much clearer boundaries. You will have, a much better sense of how to sustain yourself, and we'll work together for a really long time, and you'll have a greater impact in the long run. So which is it, Kate? I don't mind. I'll manage you, just differently either way. Are you a professional or are you a martyr? And, clearly Kate was telling me that for a reason, like at the time. So I call myself a recovering martyr, very much. But that's a question that I very much keep. Yeah, I very much keep dear to my heart. Am I a martyr or am I a professional? And it's a great question to be regularly checking in on.
Very interesting. All right, last question. Who or what inspires you?
I think I get the honour of seeing every day how we can overcome even the most toughest of circumstances. That force and strength of the human spirit is just amazing. Disaster teaches you that. And although I can tell you people who overcome and discover this amazing strength, they often don't feel strong along the way, right? So have heart. But as humans, we've overcome all sorts of adversity over the millennia. So that capacity to withstand and endure and to come out the other side stronger, that's pretty inspiring to me.
Thank you so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Jolie. Your perspective is empowering and brilliant. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
I also want to thank those listening in. Don't forget that we took great notes on this episode for you, and you can grab those notes for free at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you're ready for your Project HR debut, our team is always looking for outstanding guests. Let us know about your expertise at projecthr@iriconsultants.com. Of course, don't forget to subscribe to Project HR. A new episode drops every Thursday. Finally, drop me a line, leave us a review, or give the show a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's all for this week's episode of Project HR. Let's make it a great day at work.